Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator here. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. Well, unfortunately, I wasn't able to get my wife to agree to do a video about the consent rules in Dune, but I did manage to get a very special guest star to come on and talk about it. So everyone give a big Total Party welcome to Alexander Skarsgård, star of the upcoming Gerard Villalobos' Dune adaptation in theaters or streaming services this autumn. Yes, I'm the, yeah, oh, wait a minute, what? Uh, how am I supposed to know? There's no marker for how high I float. Greetings. I am the Dr. Baron Vladistok Harkonnen, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the consent rules in Dune. Now, I've had to put a lot of thought into consent as the Lord and Overmaster of Gidi Prime, especially because I do myself like to enjoy a little bit of role-playing with my nephew Fade Rotha from time to time, but he's not always in the mood. And often when those sorts of days are going on, I take a long stroll down to the local Subway sandwich shop and order a 12-inch meatball. Sometimes I even get two. I'll hand one to my loyal manservant Nafud and have him carry it for me on the way back home and keep it in my refrigerator. Anyway, though, as a very sadistic world leader, I must say I, too, actually consent to the inclusion of consent roles in this, the Dune Adventures in the Imperium role-playing game. Because that way, as a member of the Gygaxian school of DMing, I can carefully monitor how tense and afraid and uptight my players are as I constantly undermine their every whim and wish, with plot twist after plot twist, and annihilating booby traps and puzzles that there's no human way that could possibly know without having read novel upon novel of world information for context. Just like the Dune Adventures in the Imperium role-playing game, come to think of it. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Go out there and order your consent dice tonight from Modiphius.com. I recommend you use them. Your players may not be into it at first, but, if you're just persistent, eventually they'll be forced to accept the consent dice. Now, if you couldn't tell by the title of this video, I'm going to be talking today about the new Dune Adventures in the Imperium role-playing game by Modiphius Entertainment. When I picked this book up a couple weeks ago, I was looking forward to getting to review it. It's a fresh title. The new adaptation is coming out, hopefully, in October. That all looks good. It's, I got a chance to play the Star Trek Adventures role-playing game that Modiphius did for a couple months back during this last winter. So I have a chance to maybe even be able to analyze this and have some insight on how, the rules changes they've made to their 2D20 system might play things out. I was really thinking it was going to be a nice, positive review. And unfortunately, the more I've read into it, the more I found myself a little deflated in wanting to make this video. Now, in general, I would say this book is worth picking up under certain circumstances. If you are a big fan of Frank Herbert's Dune, definitely. The art production quality, the research that goes into the setting details and all that kind of stuff is very thorough and accurate to the books. It does incorporate a lot of stuff from the Brian Herbert spin-off novels, which I'm a little, about, but if anything, that does at least potentially open up a few other eras of play if you want to run Dune set during the Butlerian Jihad or something like that. And because of my experience with Star Trek, I was anticipating that, the rules might have a few issues with them, but it's going to have a really fun character creation system, and, it's going to, have a nice, thorough presentation of the Dune universe. But the character creation system is actually kind of flat. It's very vague. I would say, beyond being, if you're a Dune fan, if you're an experienced dungeon master and you have very experienced creative players, then yes, this might be a good game for you to try out. However, the character creation is so broad, and how you can come up with concepts for it
which, like, on the surface isn't necessarily a bad thing, but for people who are new to the Dune universe, or have mainly only, like, maybe seen, like, the old movie or the miniseries from the Sci-Fi Channel, it might be hard for them to kind of figure out exactly what they want to do with it. And there's another kind of flaw in the presentation of this book. Most role-playing games are written in such a way that while presenting the setting, there's little hints of kinds of plot hooks that you, as the dungeon master, game master, referee, whatever you're calling yourself, can pick up on and develop into, like, bigger and larger stories. And this kind of unfortunately just presents the Dune universe as is, and because the Dune universe is so, the books are so tied up into the big arcing plots of politics and power, there's very little in the way of what life is like for the everyman. And since most role-playing games at least start off with characters playing, Joe Average, and then learning how to become a big important person as they gain power and contacts and wealth and experience, I find it it's not terribly obvious what to do. This has a chapter for all the characters are supposed to all be members of the same house that they all get to make together. On the surface, sounds cool. However, that makes a lot of the interesting factions of the Dune universe be like kind of a subset. You could be a Sook Doctor, you could be a Spacing Guild member, you can be a member of the Bene Gesserit, but that is secondary to the fact that as a player group, you're all part of a same house. And the house creation rules are unfinished. I mean, they actually tell you so in the chapter on house creation rules that, yeah, the rest of it will be in some supplement down the line, which, right off the bat, major fail. Especially considering that in the Star Trek Klingon Empire variant rulebook for Star Trek Adventures, it has a whole big, thoroughly fleshed out chapter on how to make a house for the Klingon Empire. Why they couldn't just port that over and, change a few names from Klingon to Harkonnen and stuff like that, and bam, they would have had a complete system. Also, because the character creation is so open, you don't have that life path type aspect that Star Trek Adventures and also even Conan and other Modiphius products, as far as I'm aware, present. You have to kind of just make all your own decisions, which, yes, is kind of cool, but there's a thing about, especially with Star Trek's character creation, where you can go in and you have an idea of what you want to play, but there's a few things that are randomized so that you end up having a character that's a little surprising to you and maybe takes some directions you weren't expecting it to go, which to me is fun, and from having had people make Star Trek characters, they find it very fun and engaging too. And Dune is lacking that. Ironically, though, its rule system, this of the like 4 or 5 different Modiphius games that I have actually looked over, and the one I've run, this might have the best version of the 2D20 system. Most simplified and easiest to understand, and stripped down of a lot of the excess baggage. The fact that they've replaced character physical and mental attributes with basically a system of ethics that characters rank and then combine with their skills. It seems weird, but it also potentially has the advantage of actually bringing character roleplay into the dice mechanics of playing the game, which potentially could be interesting. Now, is this a game for a beginning game master? No. You want to have played a little bit of role-playing games before jumping right into this one, I would think. And my recommendation is, if you want to really be able to fully actualize the setting, you're going to have at least read the Frank Herbert novels and maybe a few of the Brian Herbert novels, although I don't really see that they're, aside from the Butlerian Jihad trilogy, I don't really see that they're too terribly necessary. Personal recommendation of mine, just for me trying to think of what to do with it, would be set it close to one of the established time periods, but not during the established time period, so that you can still get the feel of that era in terms of the political dynamics and the technology levels and all that kind of stuff, but pulled away enough that you're not having to deal with the players directly interfering with plot lines that are, hardwired into the settings progression. For example, if you wanted to set your game in the classic, first novel type setting that is presented in the movies, maybe set it 100 years or so before the events of the first Dune book. That, before the Harkonnens even got control of Arrakis, back when House Riches had Arrakis. That way you can still, you still have the universe close enough to the period of Paul Muad'Dib that, most things are as is. People who've read the book or have seen the movies or be familiar with the look and the types of characters that are in it, but all the people that are, directly involved with all these machinations that go around with the Kwisatz Haderach haven't been born yet. It would give you as a dungeon master and your players a lot more freedom. Unfortunately, the thing that's really cringe about Dune, Adventures in the Imperium, and I'm not really sure how much you could rest it entirely on the feet of Modiphius and not just as a general trend that the mainstream game publishers are kind of all going through right now. But this book not only has a little section about player consent, but it actually introduces table mechanics for signaling your level of comfort to your game master as the game goes along. And there's just some subtle things about how it's written where, it feels like it needs to remind you to include black people into your NPCs. I would think that anyone with the kind of mindset it would take to enjoy Dune at all and want to run the role-playing game probably doesn't need that kind of advice. It's like it's written with the kind of the assumption that the people who are going to be playing this are white and that they need to be reminded to include ethnic minorities, and that they're going to be, running games set in the Dune universe that are full of gore and scary insects and, non-consensual activities. And, it's an unfortunate thing where the herd's always kind of kept to the speed of its slowest member. Because as I say, my assumption would be anyone who's got the mentality that would be attracted to this game in the get-go wouldn't be doing any of those sorts of things anyway. However, because of the fact that there are those horror stories out there in the gaming world of inappropriate people doing inappropriate things, I guess they feel the need to have to put this kind of stuff in here. But, it's one thing to, suggest having a session 0 where everyone discusses what's going to be on, and people, if they have any, hey, I can't deal with spiders, they go ahead and mention that then. But the idea of actually having, a colored item that you have, in your little area of your player stuff, where you can change it from green to yellow to red, so you can let the DM know that what he's doing is no bueno. On the surface, you don't even have to use it. But because it's built in, it's in the book, it's going to suggest to people that maybe they should use it. And it is actually making a mechanic out of it, an actual rules mechanic. And I can't help but wonder how the ripple effects of something like that will have over time. I'm going to do a follow-up video about this with my wife, because she also has some things to say about it, because I let her download the free PDF that comes along with this so she could read it on her phone. And she certainly has quite a few things to say about it. But, I guess the crux of her point that I'll just at least say here is that right off the bat, when she plays one of these games, because her character is in jeopardy, she's automatically feeling uncomfortable. So if we were to be using that kind of a dynamic where she had a little color chart or a color wheel she could spin to signal to me passively that, how she feels about things, she's already starting off in yellow. And I imagine anyone who's concerned about their character's welfare, are they going to be super comfortable during a game where their character's under threat? Even if it's not, something that's, some sort of edgelord bullshit. I don't know. It sets me back a little bit. And like I said, there's kind of a subtle attitude where it kind of reads like they're just kind of assuming the worst of the people who are going to be playing this. And that's odd. It's hard to grade. Like I said, it might be the best version of Modiphius' rules to date, but the character creation is lackluster. The house rules are unfinished, which is a major flaw if the first thing you're supposed to do in session 0 before you even make your characters is to have all the players design their house. Joined tonight by Lady Waspinator, because I wanted to talk about everyone's favorite subject, which is consent rules and role-playing games for tabletop environments. A few role-playing game companies have started to do the tepid first steps of introducing consent rules into their actual physical, game products. And lately there's been a lot of buzz on Twitter and probably other places online amongst the youths who seem to think that if everyone had their own consent forms and got everyone else to sign their consent forms, then they're going to be able to have an amazing time having fantasy adventures in a Dungeons & Dragons or other role-playing game environment. Lady Waspinator here was kind enough to look up and to see actually what was on some of these consent forms, so we weren't just conjecturing what all was there. And so what kind of stuff did you discover that you find off-putting?
I find the entire concept a bit off-putting, but maybe not for the same reasons that you do.
Mm-hmm.
It does make gameplay a lot more difficult. First of all, these forms are very long, and to sit there and go through them all. I mean, I'm assuming people aren't checking off every box. I don't want spiders or depression or any mention of cancer, and definitely no off-the-shoulder nudity among non-player characters. That's disgusting.
Yeah, non-shoulder nudity and something that is entirely in your imagination is pretty offensive, and I'm shocked. The first one you showed me, I thought it was funny that, like, on it had a thing that I myself have always employed, which is just in whatever session 0, or you're just putting out your advertisement of what you want people to come play, because you don't just say, hey, I'm going to run a role-playing game and say nothing. You're generally going to say, I'm going to run this game, and it's going to be about this, and I need this many players, yada, yada, yada. And so I would typically just kind of just use the American film and television rating system. You know, is this going to be a PG, a PG-13? Is it going to be R-rated? Is it going to be NC-17? Is it going to be rated X? Other countries have other versions of that, so like it doesn't, you know, wherever you are, you have an easy-to-go reference that everyone in your player group should already kind of understand, so they can have some idea that, like, oh, this is rated R. You can even include that it's rated R for violence, or if someone's smoking cigarettes, or, you know, sexual innuendo.
But so in a sense, you've already been doing that.
It's with a lot of these things that are becoming controversies in gaming, it's not so much that the thing being proposed in and of itself is some sort of bad idea, and even as like something that you had said earlier when we were first talking about this, in some ways the disclosure agreement, I mean the consent agreement forms kind of can also give you protection from other people doing weird shit and accusing you of doing something, and then you can like, no, you said this was okay. But on the other end, that could also be a way to provide people cover to get away with doing things that could be construed as abusive, and then just saying they're like, yeah, but you told me I could do it, kind of thing, because you signed the form. It cuts both ways. I feel it's unnecessary, and the sheer amount of things that were on there, some of which, like, why is all this sex stuff even coming up? and like, what kind of role-playing games are y'all playing out there? I'm jealous. Like, you know, like, these are ostensibly still supposed to be things that kids should play, so, like, I don't know why we need to have a fetishist's non-disclosure agreement. Like, this is 50 Shades of Grey, and you need to, like, let us know, you know, in between, you know, having combat with goblins, how much wax you want dribbled on your back while you're tied up to a T-cross thing in my basement. That's not supposed to, like I don't know what you're doing, but you're role-playing wrong. Part of me, you know, I saw some snide Twitter. It's what kind of got me started on this tangent. I don't want to make this video right now, but I saw someone on Twitter who had made a comment that was like, you know, anyone who makes fun of RPG safety rules, the safety rules are working already, because you know then that, you know, they're not a safe person you want to play with, and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, you know, if you're persistent and don't take no for an answer, eventually your players will be forced to agree to use the consent rules. And guilt and social pressure is a great technique in order to be able to convince impressionable young people to do as you tell them to do, whether or not they might have misgivings. Like, how are you supposed to write adventures where you're having to constantly second guess every little NPC decision you make, especially when you're doing so much of it on the fly, reacting to players?
I mean, also, that's a whole problem with consent in this type of thing to begin with. It's not real. You know it's not real.
What? It's not real? I wasn't really fighting a dragon in Narnia with all my best friends as elven rangers from Shangri-La? I mean, what?
I am a person who very strongly anthropomorphizes my character.
Yeah, a lot of people do. They can't help it.
And I'm not comfortable when a lot of things happen. Even things that most people are very comfortable with. You're walking down the road and you see something up ahead. Oh my God.
What is it?
That makes me really uncomfortable.
It's going to kill my character.
So if you asked me every time, are you okay with this?
Yeah.
A lot of times I'm going to be like, no, I want to go home and eat soup.
There's a lot of stuff that's like unclear. Also, like who exactly is are the DMs supposed to be handing out the consent forms to the players, or is this for the players to get the DM to sign to make sure that the DM has been vetted somehow by their willingness to play along with this? I know on like I said, on some levels it's not like this is entirely outside of what can be described as reasonable. So there is a degree where trying to take a hard line no stance on consent forms is kind of being unreasonable. But if you aren't willing to ever draw that line somewhere, eventually the tide's going to erase your sandcastle, and there's nothing you can do about it. Unless you actually put a wall up around it to protect it from the tide.
Like you're saying though, you're getting consent when you describe the game to them and tell them what's going to happen and give it a rating.
One of my followers on Twitter, who's a lawyer, had commented on some of my tweets about this. Whereas this sort of stuff certainly wouldn't be ironclad in a court system. Like you might think you might be able to use this to protect yourself from something that happens in a role-playing game if someone claims mental abuse. But it's not like an actual honest-to-God, notarized contract or anything. It's just, as valid as me writing a contract off on a piece of notepaper with someone when they're drunk.
It makes people feel more comfortable.
Also, there's this thing that about humanity that people seem to forget in terms of, like, a lot of the stuff especially since a lot of the consent lines were not just yes or no, but like a gradient of yes to no. That reminded me of those kinds of psychological tests they give people who are looking for employment. I don't know how to tell people this, but human beings can lie. Ta-da! They could give you all the right answers on that consent form and still actually not abide and feel held or bound to be obligated to follow any of that. It's just a piece of paper. And if since you're already telling people ahead of time what the game is and what it's going to be like and what level of graphicness and all that kind of stuff, by attending you're already consenting. It'd be like if you went to go see The Matrix Resurrections in theaters right now. Check Ticketmaster to get tickets online.
Fandango now, but sure.
Or whatever. People want to see The Matrix Resurrections. I'm the only person who liked it. And I spent most of my time complaining about it too. But I like complaining about things. Yeah, what if The Matrix Resurrections, not only do you have to buy your ticket and go into the movie theater and willingly sit down and watch it and stay the whole time, because you're also, you can pick up and leave at any point you feel like you're offended by this movie. But what if it also wanted you to sign a consent form? I mean, it wouldn't harm you, but why is that necessary? You've already consented by being there, so why do you need the paper trail?
I mean, sure, if you're doing something really awful. That was one of the first things you said when we first discovered this in the Dune book, is that they're assuming the absolute worst.
Yeah.
The absolute worst.
Well, you'd ask me if a player asked me to sign a consent form, would I do it, or not allow them to play? And whereas, like I said, on some level it is a little unreasonable to be completely hardline about this sort of thing. On the other hand, that's kind of insulting because you're coming into my house and then just handing me this thing that's assuming that I'm going to be molesting your character and exposing you to fictional cancer and fictional gaslighting. Oh, that was one of my favorite thing that was on there was that fictional gaslighting. That so much can be swept underneath that. A thing that game masters have to do while running their adventures is use misdirection. Where, if you want characters to be able to fall for a puzzle or fall for a mystery or fall for a trap so they can then enjoy the adventure of overcoming this thing or figuring it out, that requires you doing things that fall under the umbrella of gaslighting. So, what kind of miserable... what if you have to consent to harming animals, you have to consent to harming people, you have to consent to fictional nudity, fictional sex. Like I said, there's too much sex stuff on here. This should not be involved in these things. These are, you might be adults playing with adults, but this is still a fucking kids game. Are you sitting around playing Monopoly with adults with your fucking dicks out, just wanking it, moving your little thimble guy around? No. Everyone really, if everyone, all sides, all that shit, I feel if I have a message, it's that everyone needs to grow the fuck up and chill out a little bit about all this shit. To me, it seems like a red flag. If someone was running a game and they wanted me to sign a bunch of paperwork agreeing to consent to things, that would make me wonder, like, what the fuck's going on in your game? That seems kind of like what exactly are you planning on doing here?
It's weird that companies seem to think that we've become so uncivil and unable to actually communicate with one another that we need a form.
I mean, and yet, like, I can remember back to, like, especially when I was younger in my 90s. I mean, not in my 90s, in the 90s. And, I've personally been witness to some pretty awful behavior from people, especially, like, in the gaming community, from DMs and players alike. Like, I feel sorry for, like, girl players in the 90s sometimes of being dropped into these environments, and the kind of weird jockeying and the way they'd be passed up the hierarchy. The DM always has to have the girlfriend kind of shit. The way being a DM kind of automatically gives you this temptation. It's real easy to develop a little personal cult of personality out of your players, who all become very loyal. And when you catch yourself falling into those kinds of things, you need to try to give yourself a little mental distance from that, because we don't need to be tyrants. And if we want people to take us seriously and feel safe playing these games and not make everyone jump through hoops, then we need to be honest about the fact that, like, these things can happen and have happened in the past, but they shouldn't reflect on the entire fucking game. Human beings still have agency. I thought, like, at least I'm assuming that.
Yeah, you can just say, "Hey, whoa, I'm not comfortable with that."
And, like, also,
you can also leave.
Akin to the people can lie, there are people who will take advantage of this.
Yeah.
Like I said, they can use the consent form to cover for them getting away with poking at doing things that they probably otherwise wouldn't be doing. But hey, you said I can have, fictional NPC, your character's knocked up now, you check the box, you said you'd be okay with it. And, it's something you were saying about, like, since Dune introduced the thing where you're supposed to have dice or something that indicates your tension level, well, you would always have yours dialed in at 4.
Yeah.
Kind of a thing.
Yeah.
Also, I could see, like, people with a sadistic streak, like, if you have this thing on the table, you want to see it being used. So I can see there should be some game masters out there who'd be purposely trying to get their players to dial that thing up all the way to maximum just to see it happen.
Yeah. And, like you've said, it causes a lot of second guessing on the part of the player, who normally says, "Yes, I'm here for this game. Let's go. What do you got for me?" And now every single thing that happens, am I comfortable with this? How comfortable am I with this?
I need you to roll initiative, but are you okay with this?
It doesn't.
The goblin's going to attack you,
these
but are you okay?
It doesn't matter how comfortable you are. Your character is going to go through this shit, and you are going to go through it.
This adventure module says you have to fight the guy in this cave, but are you okay with going into a cave? Is that going to give you bad childhood memories of claustrophobia?
Right. Yeah. Second guess.
Are you going to, like, be worried about what if someone else...
Am I? I hadn't thought about it before.
What if someone else that's not even here could hypothetically have been offended by you having to go into that cave?
I'm actually just not super comfortable in cold places, and all this description of snow is kind of bothering me. So can we just change the setting to, like, not mountains?
I could just completely erase all of my plans that I told you about ahead of time before you said you'd come and show up today.
But I feel uncomfortable, and
I don't want you to be uncomfortable. It's very important that you're super comfortable at all times in this game that's inherently based on tension, because you're worried that your character might die, and that's what provides... It's like the gambler's thing. The thing that keeps people gambling isn't the winning, it's the losing, and it's the fear of loss. And then when you get that dopamine rush of winning and having overcome that, like, that's what you're actually trying to strike again and again. Role-playing games, like a lot of things in life, feed off a dopamine reward response limbic shit going on in your brain. And without tension, what are you doing? You're just sitting around having an imaginary conversation with people, pretending to be other people who aren't even humans, even though you're all very much humans. It's why I'm worried that D&D Evolution could be a metaverse thing, because then they can finally have the D&D they want, where there's no combat, nothing exciting. You're just sitting around a virtual table that looks like it's a virtual, hall built into the inside of a gigantic living oak. like just, whatever that end of the last house or whatever the fuck it's called in Dragonlance looks just like it, and you all got your little cartoon avatars surrounding your body, so you don't have to see your ugly fucking human faces, and you can automatically have all your consent forms, built into the agreements that you signed and clicked on that you didn't actually bother reading when you signed up for your Facebook Meta account.
You would know whether you checked "I'm okay with spiders" or not.
Yeah. Well, maybe they could maybe kind of be like one of those questionnaire things like they do on Twitter when they're trying to figure out with your new account what kind of content you'd like to. Are you into music? Except it's all like this weird sadistic psychological. Like, are you afraid of spiders? Are you afraid of bats? Are you afraid of murder? Like, yeah, I'm afraid, but I'm not playing a game. It's not me in there, so who cares what I'm the fuck afraid of? Whatever happened to like confrontational therapy? That your way of getting over phobias was that you have like, oh, you're arachnophobic. Well, you're gonna have to have a pet tarantula,
right,
to make yourself,
Right. I don't know if that
like aren't role playing games a great way to do that? You're afraid of spiders. Well, like let's fight an imaginary spider, and then after you've killed him with your imaginary sword and with your imaginary little halfling.
I mean, maybe. Depends on how afraid of spiders you are. I don't think people are that severely phobic that often that you actually need that on the floor. It's a real severe phobia to be that afraid of spiders that you can't say spiders or talk about them. Or
maybe like the counter push for this is to like, okay, we'll go with the consent form, and then we need to figure out like an answer matrix of if people answer this way, they're going to be a good player, and if people answer this way, they're going to be a bad player. And so someone who's saying they want to consent to a bunch of weird sexual shit but can't handle cancer and spiders, you conveniently figure out some polite way to usher them out the door, whereas the person who's like, yeah, no, I don't want my character to be getting his dick wet I'm not here to hang out with a bunch of other dudes to describe my fictional dude having sex with fictional women who are being controlled by the dude over there behind the DM screen. There's something weird about all that, and that's why I typically don't do that in my own games, because I don't want to have simulated sex with other guys.
Yeah.
In the form of elves and imaginary hookers.
And that's okay.
Is it though? Like maybe they're in the wrong. Like maybe if this is like if you want to have a bunch of consent forms in your files at home, that people are going to see when you pass away, and they're going through all your shit about all the kind of weird kinky sex you want to have in a role playing game. Maybe you should be in the fetish community and instead be signing consent forms to be having weird kinky sex.
Be in the fetish community.
Like
in the imaginary fetish community, whatever.
You want to pretend you're an owl person, be a fetishist furry. I'm probably sure there's probably a thing for people who like to fucking dress up as elves. But maybe Dungeons and Dragons, ages 12 and up, is not really the environment for that stuff in the first fucking place. Also, before we had looked at this, I kept saying it's like, I know this is mostly about like, in-game kind of stuff, but just by using the word consent, it kind of equates it to some sort of sexual thing. And then we looked at what was on there, and like a quarter of it was sex. So like,
yeah.
But I don't know. My favorite thing on there was gaslighting. Do you have a personal favorite, a thing that you're supposed to consent that you saw on there?
Thirst.
Thirst?
Yeah.
Do they mean like the slang thirst, like they're horny?
I don't think so. I think they meant like
your character. So no desert adventures or anything where they bicycle a little too long.
Provided with water.
Your imaginary character has to have imaginary water so they don't become imaginary dehydrated.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes.
Well, even you could have just had a glass of water a half an hour ago and be perfectly hydrated and still get thirsty.
Yeah, that's
so.
True. That's true. Especially under extreme conditions. Yeah. Well, but you don't have to tell me that, right? Like, as long as you tell me I'm hydrated.
Like, I generally
I'll feel good.
Those are the sorts of things that, like, those are the kinds of details I tend to not necessarily bring up unless the players are really hung up or you're trying to get across an extreme environment.
Right.
You don't use the cold, negative penalty rules for when it's 60 degrees, but when the characters are, like, in an Arctic environment and it's -10, then you use the penalties. You know, like, characters shouldn't have to worry about being properly hydrated unless, like, the whole point of the scene that they're in is they're trying to cross some impassable fucking desert and their camels are dead.
Yeah, so none of that, basically. None of that.
Yeah.
Don't do that.
No, but like I said, there's so many variables on these, and also, like, there's addendum consent forms. So, like, the basic consent form doesn't have enough stuff. It's not specific enough. So here's a bunch of extra shit for specific. Can your character eat another character's ass while fucking the other character missionary style? You know, like, are you allowed to own sex slaves? It's very important to me to own sex slaves in my fictional universe. What the fuck are some of you people doing? Like, this is, like, you know, D&D doesn't have to be wholesome. It can be edgy. You can have cursing. It's fine to have some, you know, like, you know, sexuality is part of the human experience, so you can't entirely excise all trace of it. But, like, fucking A, man, this isn't Debbie Does Neverwinter, you know?
I hope.
So, I don't know. You got anything else you want to add that you felt like you wanted to say before we wrap this up?
I mean, I don't know what people are doing that this is necessary. I don't like that it adds focus to things that you otherwise wouldn't be focusing on, particularly in the "are you okay with this" scenario. I think asking people if, you know, there's a lot of stuff I'm not okay with that I have to do anyway.
Yeah.
I'm not okay with going to work for $7 an hour. You know, I don't consent to that. But I have to pay my bills, so I do it. I'm
not okay with, like, all my favorite childhood properties being rebooted into oblivion, and, you know, but
yeah, there's a bunch of shit. I didn't consent to that. I'm not going to consent to it, but it's happening anyway, and I need to find the best way to get through it. And walking around asking everybody, "Are you okay with this?" all the time, well, I hope not. That's life. You're not supposed to be okay with everything.
Yeah.
And to give people the expectation that you should be happy and comfortable all the time is crazy. That's craziness. Not to say that your gaming experience should be unpleasant, but you should be on edge a good portion of the time, worried about your fictional character, but not so worried that you have a nervous breakdown if somebody in the game has cancer.
It's just the idea that they're trying to, like, especially, like, trying to use social pressure to guilt trip people into using consent forms is so fucking ironic. The real flaw with Dune as a role-playing game, and actually is translated into most other forms of media outside of the original novels, is that its real message is kind of lost. You know, we basically keep coming back around and focusing on the first book. Maybe, if we're lucky, we got that one sci-fi miniseries that actually got through the second two sequels, Dune Messiah and Children of Dune. But you don't really see the point of what Dune's actually doing as an overall saga, the greater story of it, until you get to at least God Emperor of Dune, and arguably not really until you get to Heretics and Chapter House Dune. And that is it's telling, you know, the greater arc of history and leading the audience as a living witness, so to say, to events that in the original books, you know, are even if they're remarkable people, it's still just the deeds of people who are fallible in all their various ways and make their mistakes. And then you get to the fourth book and you've jumped forward several thousand years, and suddenly these historical events are now mythical. And then you jump forward another several thousands of years, and those original events are like have grown beyond myth into, like, you know, universal religious concepts and such. We go from Muad'Dib just being a person who, like I said, was talented and was a remarkable person in his own way, but was not a god, and for all of his clairvoyant vision of the future, was not infallible and truly prescient. But by the time you get to, you know, Heretics of Dune and Chapter House Dune, you know, people just casually pray to him and believing, you know, these kind of grandiose ideas of what these people were like, even with the fact that there's technology in this timeline that can better preserve records across time. But still, everything is lionized and made to be more epic in scale, more profound. These have become fundamental roots to an entire civilizational culture that is itself diversified into a little hydra-headed entity that's starting to curl back upon itself. Unfortunately, the books were never finished, so we never got to see what the real true final grand design was. Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson did put out a variety of novels based on Frank Herbert's works. I generally do not like them. I feel like in a lot of ways they kind of miss the message. They don't even attempt to try to write in the same fashion. Therefore, they're just kind of you're used to these books that are not just telling a story, but are giving you all these great philosophical and political insights. And then you come over to the Brian Herbert and Kevin J. Anderson books, which now vastly outnumber the original Dune books. And, they're just kind of fairly generic sci-fi stories, with these characters' names attached to things, but none of the characters really feel right. I'm rather disappointed in Brian Herbert, although in terms of the writing, that's probably more Kevin J. Anderson's problem. One would wish he could have hired a better ghostwriter, but the problem with all these things is kind of like the question of, like, why can't we get any good showrunners or good writers to run Star Trek? A good science fiction writer has absolutely no motivation to go and write somebody else's property. They did do 2 books that were based on the outline that Herbert had for what the last Dune book was supposed to be. Obviously, they stretched it out and made 2 big, thick novels out of it and intruded a bunch of their own stuff into these things. However, underneath all of that, though, if you're a studied fan of Frank Herbert, not just his Dune books, but I've also read some of his other materials, like if you've, ever read, like, The Dasadi Experiment or Destination Void or The Lazarus Effect or any of that kind of stuff, you could, like, see underneath what they were writing, the things that actually were, like, stuff that was supposed to be there. Stuff like Duncan Idaho is actually the ultimate Kwisatz Haderach because he's a living witness to history. He's got the Bene Gesserit and, like, Leto II, he's got thousands of years of all these gathered memories. But unlike Leto and unlike the Bene Gesserit, all those memories are his because he kept being cloned, made into a Gola over and over and over again, and having those memories awakened and then having that life. And then at the very last final version of Duncan Idaho in the books had all of that put into him at once and awakened because of his encounter with Marbella and the Honored Matres. And if you can't tell, the stuff I like about Dune is, like the larger big picture stuff. It's one of the things that is one of the few promises that is to be found in this book is that it doesn't have to be set during the original movie. You don't have to set it on Dune during the time of Paul Atreides. They've made hints and in the text that they might put out source books for some of these other time periods. The media trend is going to cause them to always fixate upon the first one, especially since the whole thing's branded around the title Dune. How do you make a role-playing game about the greater setting and call it Dune without still kind of making the planet Arrakis the focus of the whole thing in the end, even if you might, provide enough detail where people can set it on other places? But are you really playing Dune if you're running a game set on Giedi Prime? Kind of thinking. And so far their initial output of source material that they have released since the initial rulebook came out has all been focused around the even less so the events of the first book, but more the events of the first of this new movie series that Gerard Villeneuve is making for us. It's nice. It was an all right movie. I'm sure the second one will be okay. I have my issues with it. For other kinds of entertainment media, they're always going to be hung up on the beginning of the story, and therefore you're never it's giving the mass audience kind of a false impression about what this shit's about, even because if you don't get to the later parts, then like I said, you don't get to be as an audience witness to the shift and how these things that you just saw with your own eyes and how that's being talked about thousands of years later. You don't get to experience the disconnect.
I almost wish they would have just jumped in and made God Emperor of Dune and focused that around that clone of Duncan Idaho, which is my favorite of the various Duncan Idahos. He's arguably the worst version of Duncan Idaho that lived, in terms of, like holding up to his, the things that made Duncan Idaho a signature person. However, I still find him to be my favorite, the most compelling, the most identifiable. Man lost out of time. There's also this kind of echo, because Duncan Idaho is your audience entry character in much of the later books, which is also all kind of weird, and you wouldn't necessarily pick up on as long as you just continue to focus on the first part of the Dune series. That's why I question Jason Momoa, being cast, because, as Duncan Idaho, the dumbass fighter, sure, but what if they did actually manage to carry these movies beyond just Dune 1 and 2 and make Dune Messiah? Are they going to recast Jason Momoa? Are they going to, de-age him so you get kind of a younger Baywatch vintage Jason Momoa? And how well is he going to pull off playing a Mentat? How much are you going to buy in to Duncan Idaho, the Mentat, as portrayed by Jason Momoa? Early on, back when Dune had first come out, there was some fake controversy, and some people were like, oh, this is old misogynist, all these men running the galaxy, and men this, and it's all about a man, and he's a colonizing, cultural appropriating lad, and all that kind of shit. Kind of not, once again, because Hollywood and mass entertainment consumers never get past the first one or two Dune books. They don't see that part of the story is, yes, it starts off during this very patriarchal, feudal time period, but a lot of, especially what God Emperor Leto II is doing during his 5,000-year reign, is shoving human culture into becoming a female-dominated society, more kind of probably influenced by second-wave feminism, because there is, a lot of elements of women's sexual liberation kind of written into the text. But, much kind of just realizing that, men can be manipulated and controlled and harnessed through, feminine wiles. And then have that energy and violence focused and directed in the directions that they want to point it at, kind of a thing. The end result of the setting is a very, diversified, divested, decentralized culture. There is no longer any central imperial structure. The guild no longer has a monopoly on space travel. Technology has made a slow creep back, albeit there is still resistance to too much computerization. And we'll never get to see that. The role-playing game is our only chance to maybe get to have that in any kind of entertainment media that isn't the novels, which is always going to be an uphill sell to actually get people to sit down and read the fucking shit. It's much easier to put them in front of a television or to have them play a role-playing game. And so it'd just be really nice if they would actually focus on that side of the setting instead of just constantly repeating the same old shit we've already seen a third of a dozen times. The Bene Gesserit are arguably the most important faction in the entire human sphere of influence across the entire Dune timeline. They are not literal psychics, they are not literal witches. They play up on these stereotypes and fears and cultural superstitions, but anytime there is a mention of telepathy in the Frank Herbert books, they are not talking about literal telepathy where you're reading someone's mind from across the room or any of that stuff. They are super skilled yoga martial artists who are highly educated in politics and psychology and trained for, reading people's nervous tics and voice usage and all that kind of stuff, so they can, basically deduce with a high degree of accuracy what someone's thinking or feeling, and be able to use that then to manipulate them. The thing that the movies in particular always seem to get wrong is the concept of the witch's voice. It's not the thing done in the movies where it's all come over here and put your hand in my box, in my box, in my box. It's not that kind of stuff. It's just reading how someone carries themselves and talks, where you are able to figure out exactly what kind of tone and timber to take with them so that they will respond in the way that you want them to respond. People who've had display the traits of someone who's had military conditioning. If you bark at them in just the right way, they'll instinctively react, and even if they might catch themselves a moment later. That you kind of played with them based on some sort of muscle memory almost, in terms of how they were raised and conditioned by parents, society, social status, profession. All sorts of different things can have those sorts of influences on people. The thing with the Bene Gesserit is, for the majority of the Dune timeline, you could describe them as operating as a shadow matriarchy. They've embedded themselves throughout the political system of the galaxy, but they do not openly rule it. They want to use males. There's a thing in Dune where there's kind of a false impression of a feudal patriarchy going on in the early half of it. But the Bene Gesserit are playing a long game of chess. They might have less impact on immediate things that are going on, but in terms of the long arc of history, they're guiding humanity towards a certain end. What that end was, we never get to see, because the whole thing was ruined by Jessica. The Bene Gesserit's hatred of Jessica, carried forward through forward history past the initial Dune books, is rather justified. Their entire breeding program leading up to the search for the Kwisatz Haderach was not supposed to end the way it ended. That bloodline was never supposed to be bred into with wild Fremen genes from some random sand tart that Paul picked up on Arrakis. Leto II was never supposed to exist. And Leto II both gave the Bene Gesserit everything they wanted, in a way, in the final picture of the known universe after his passing. But he also kind of set up the conditions so that they would find their ultimate demise. He certainly, during his long reign, would have had the time and power to wipe the Bene Gesserit out if he so chose, but he had carried so much of them within himself that I don't think he, could ever actually bring himself to do that sort of thing. But he certainly set things up so that centuries, millennia later, the Bene Gesserit's own offspring would kind of come back and wipe them out, take them over, turn them into their new version of themselves in the form of the honored matres. The thing that was actually pushing into the realms of the superhuman with the Bene Gesserit is the internal alchemy that they eventually master. That's where they're able to take the poisonous bile of the sandworm and, alter it chemically within themselves so that it transforms from being a poison into a hallucinogenic drug. That hallucinogenic drug, combined with, their mental mastery over themselves, their muscles and their nervous systems, is what then also allows them to be able to, with physical contact, so that they can touch skin to skin and have some sort of neurological contact, that they can imprint chains of memories from other Bene Gesserit who are skilled in the same kind of thing, so that they can facilitate the transfer. That's getting kind of a bit into the realm of wonkiness in terms of how some things work. It's very speculative. The idea of the various schools of humanity, such as the Bene Gesserit, the Spacing Guild, the Bene Tleilax, and so on, is that in the wake of destroying all the computers, humanity didn't want to just go back to living in the Stone Age, and still needed to maintain, an intergalactic economy and space travel, and some planets aren't, exactly perfectly balanced for human life, and so some kinds of technology have to be maintained in several places just for people to still be able to breathe and live and eat. So, the disciplines like becoming a mentat and all this other kind of stuff were developed to push human beings to their ultimate realistic limits, but a thing that is missed in the Brian Herbert books and in the movies is that they too often turn them into a literal translation of superhuman abilities. This is not a comic book. There is still a bounded limitation. Even the fancy stuff like Paul Atreides' prescience, in many ways, is just him performing an extremely vast and complicated internal mathematic computation, just based on his ability to grasp a tremendously large amount of information points that are all happening at once that most
people can't really juggle in their brain that well. You know, most people can only predict a very narrow path in front of themselves. It didn't really get supernatural seeming until you get to the point where, like, he, you know, has his eyes burned out by the stone burner, and he's able to still see by just projecting his vision just a few seconds ahead of himself. You know, that's starting to get like into the, a bit into the realms of the paranormal. But for the most part, the Bene Gesserit are not actually, like I said, they're not literally practicing magic. There is a kind of neurological basis. The idea that you can transfer memory through that kind of base level skin-to-skin contact does have some basis in reality. Consider how many prosthetic devices can be operated and controlled by a person, you know, with an artificial arm. That it's not like being directly wired into their nervous system like some old 80s cyberpunk tech. It's just got a little touchpad on part of it that just touches your skin, and you just think about closing your hand, and it closes its hand. And so the idea that the Bene Gesserit can imprint their memories on each other is kind of like an extension of that same kind of phenomenon. But they were you know, just undermined by the same kind of phenomenon of that's described in Isaac Asimov's Foundation novels of. For all of Harry Seldon's ability to predict the future based on the patterns of psychohistory, you can't accommodate for the mules. Occasionally a random individual comes along and does things that cannot be predicted for, and for a brief moment has their thumb on the pulse of history, and forever radically alters the trajectory that things were predicted for. And then the further out from that point of disturbance, the initial prediction model falls further and further apart, which is, I guess, part of why he had established an organization like the Foundation, so there might be some sort of potential for a corrective factor as those sorts of events happened. Dune doesn't, the Bene Gesserit didn't quite ever have that. As much as they tried to maintain an effort to regain control over the breeding program, they never got there. So it had been under Leto II's control for so long, and because of the events of the scattering and the invention of no ships, and the end of the spacing guild's hold over interstellar travel as a monopoly, it was the end of the dream. There's no way to get that genie back in the bottle. You can never fully control for all the vectors again in terms of trying to create a supreme being. And really all the supreme being was them looking for a male who is capable of doing the same internal alchemy without losing their maleness. If there is one thing that seems to be kind of a bit overlooked, and kind of oddly so, as much as the media, entertainment media, likes to jump on the problematic aspects of like old things when they're bringing them back, oddly, there's been very little from like any magazine or anyone kind of like seemingly from what I've noticed who's kind of picked up on the fact that the Bene Gesserit are kind of a, well, to be frank, rather turf kind of concept. Like a transgendered woman is not able to be a Bene Gesserit, and that is not what they're looking for in a Kwisatz Haderach. So the Kwisatz Haderach is not a good analogy for that within the story. Really, the most evident aspect of transgenderism is in stuff like the Bene Tlilax and the Face Dancers, and even then that's not quite the same as like what modern day transgenderism is, because Face Dancers start off as a non-binary agendered creature that can just take either aspect and might start to imprint upon an aspect that they hold for too long. But, if you're playing Bene Gesserit or running Bene Gesserit, like most people are going to be doing it during some time around the events of the first core trio of novels, I would imagine. So, during that time period, the Bene Gesserit are like a rule from the shadows. They have a heavy push on the decisions that the men in power will make, but they're not actually the ones making decisions. It does kind of also, though, kind of allow them to continue to operate in the shadows because it's never actually their fault. They're just influencing things, but they're not the one who actually made the decision. Ironically, after Leto II is gone, and part of what I mean about how he did kind of give them what they wanted is after his death, the Bene Gesserit, were like one of the core influential powers of that original core set of the Empire after it collapsed. There's still some hint to the Landsrad in the post-scattering times. Chom is still around. The Spacing Guild is still around. They're still, the most reliable, known, best branded, space service. But no ships are still there. They just seem to primarily now a military applied craft, because they do have obvious tactical resources. So the Spacing Guild is basically just shuffling cargo and passengers, but they're not quite so much in the army business anymore. But the Bene Gesserit are much more openly in control, and as a political power. And Leto had reshaped the galaxy to be one that is, largely openly run by females. The feudal patriarchy at the beginning of the Dune series is not where the Dune series ends. Albeit, though, there are some other, maybe warning messages of how the honored matres act, and that female leadership of society does not necessarily lead to less war or anything along those lines, despite what some people might claim. That's all subject to interpretation, obviously. So, as I say, read the actual books. Don't just rely on the films or the stuff said in the Brian Herbert novels, or unfortunately this role-playing game too. If this is your introduction to Dune, it's going to tell you things in the backstory that are going to kind of give you a kind of just more dorky, surface level science fiction and impression of what these books are actually about. You can learn a lot from Dune. You can learn a lot from Dune by rereading it periodically, because you always, as you grow older, pick up on things that you didn't really kind of pick up on the first time. The thing that makes the Fremen and the Sardaukar actually mirrors of each other in many ways is that they are both the result of humans who have been unintentionally bred by the harsh conditions of the planets they find themselves on. For the Fremen, obviously, it's Arrakis, this super desert world where, even a lot of the stuff depicted, in the movie and in the original Dune novel, a lot of the technology, for gathering water and growing food, as much as they were doing in the sieges and such across the entire planet, and even down to having the better high-quality still suits, all didn't happen until Pardot Kynes came to Dune. And Pardot was Liet Kynes' father. He was the original Imperial surveyor who fell in love with the planet and started to figure all this stuff out and taught the Fremen all these things. And Liet was, his son, or in the movie, his daughter, whose mother was a Fremen woman herself. And Pardot already had gone through the motions of being the outsider from off-planet who's going to, lead the Fremen, help unite them and lead them into a better goal, except Paul comes around, slightly less than a century later and does the same thing, but on a larger scale and with more pizzazz because of the way he had been bred to interact with the spice and all that kind of stuff. But with the Fremen of the Sardaukar come from Seleucia Secundus. That was a planet that was heavily bombarded during the Machine Wars, and is just on itself just a incredibly tough world to live upon. Still radioactive in patches, harsh wildlife, extreme weather, not a whole lot of places to have gardens and food and clean anything. Both of these peoples have a strong warrior condition. On top of that, life is fragile and death can come at any moment, and so they're all kind of living on the edge and are able to get into fights, from a young age on. They're both races of natural-born killers within this fictional setting. I kind of wish that the Sardaukar were presented also as an alternative archetype that players could have, because as I say, that's why they see as something of each other in each other. Although that also leads to just an instant nemesis, rivalry, hatred. Your very existence we can't stand. We can't allow to have another fighting force out there that matches us, and so both are just instinctively driven to wipe each other out. The role-playing game, I just say, takes a bit too much of the side of the Fremen and all that, but with a little tweaking, it should be possible to make a Sardaukar character. There are aspects to Dune, the setting and the characters and how things work, that I just intrinsically believe are impossible to ever convey through other kinds of media aside from a novel, especially filmic things like television miniseries and or movies. They can come close, but there's just some things about it that, like, how, and specific to the topic of this video, how exactly is one to depict the concept of other memory in a movie or TV show that could possibly do it justice and not just seem like some trite Scorpius from Farscape or Six from Battlestar Galactica in Baltair's mind, where, you know, there's just this other character that's there, but the other characters don't see, kind of stuff, which was novel for a time back when Farscape and Battlestar Galactica were new, but, you know, we've moved past that, and that's been absorbed at least into sci-fi culture, if not the greater pop culture surrounding it, but has rippled out there because of things imitating that particular trope. You know, I mean, that'd be a good device for specific possession scenes, perhaps, you know, with Aaliyah, if we ever get to a point in films where she's grown up and then becomes possessed by the spirit of her grandfather, the Baron Vladimir Harkonnen. You know, like, because even describing what it is, like, I'm not sure that's ever going to be able to be conveyed to an audience properly. Like, as it is, it's Frank Herbert taking a lot of liberties with scientific terminology. Perhaps this is, in his own way, his own kind of a Deepak Chopra-ism, where, like, you know, Deepak Chopra likes to, you know, use a lot of quantum physics, you know, in his philosophical ramblings. But, you know, someone who's taken, you know, general relativity classes and all that kind of stuff. I'm hardly an expert on these things. I'm not a particularly, you know, wonderful mathematician or anything by any sort of stretch of the imagination, but I have a better grasp of what, you know, quantum mechanics is trying to convey than Deepak Chopra does, and in such a way, I feel that Frank Herbert has either, you know, made a few mistakes or purposely just taken some liberties with things like the concept of genetic memory. Genetic memory is kind of more speaking about just kind of the environmental imprint that could happen generation after generation from various, you know, like, you know, species clade bloodlines experiencing certain conditions over and over and over again until it becomes imprinted into the genetic matrix. And so instead of being something that those creatures would have to forcibly undergo adaptation to during the course of their lives, instead they will ratchet up automatically at birth that bit of adaptation. In terms of evolution, I am much more into the more modern ideas of adaptive evolution as opposed to random mutation evolution. Random mutations tend not to be beneficial to the host organism, despite the fact that they occur. You know, there are gene marker kind of mutations that one can use to track, but those typically don't cause, like, physical mutations. There's something that's just kind of buried in the mitochondria. And all that kind of stuff. Evolution as form of, like, forced adaptation, or sometimes even conscious and willful adaptation, makes a lot more sense, because, like, we can observe that even in the course of an individual animal's lifetime, they can make certain small minor adjustments to their physiology as needed and just compact it over time. That all adds up, kind of a thing. But in the way that, you know, you take a dog that you've, you know, been living in a more southerly warm climate and you've had this dog for years, and then you, like, you know, move up north into a more colder, cooler, temperate climate, and suddenly that dog will, you know, grow a little bit shaggier, and, you know, over time that will lead to breeds of dogs. If multiple generations of that dog's bloodline is exposed to the colder temperatures and has to grow that heavier coat of fur, at one point they'll just start off already with the heavier coat of fur, and then, you know, the spectrum to which they can push that within the course of a lifetime grows towards shaggier and shaggier and shaggier. Same thing with having to stretch your necks or use your beaks differently, all that different kind of stuff. And that's also why you have species that have lingered without having to change at all, because, like, they never really had any need for that adaptive pressure. And that's genetic memory. In Frank Herbert's, you know, universe, there is kind of the element of fantasy that is there, and so in his version of genetic memory, those who have been trained properly, you know, with both Mentat training and or Bene Gesserit training, and have gone through the transformative chemical event that is the, you know, taking of the bile of the worm and all that kind of stuff, so that one becomes, you know, a Reverend Mother and or the Kwisatz Haderach in the case of Paul, or his son Leto II. technically the third. People who've gone through the transformative process are able to neurologically link with other people who've undergone that process and basically transfer a chain of memories. In the case of the people, though, who are awakened in such a fashion while in the womb because they are unborn and they are still part of their mother's chemistry, if their mother goes through that while they are still in development, they will be pre-awakened, and instead of inheriting a chain of purposely transferred memories, because as Reverend Mothers transfer their memories to each other at the moment of death or close to the moment of death as necessary, over and over, they've accumulated hundreds and hundreds of female lives within this chain of memories. The unborn, people like Aliyah and also Ghanima and Leto II, they're able to access a chain of memories through, like their genetic ancestry, which is kind of like a next level kind of thing, and which leads to, like stuff like Aliyah becoming imprinted with the Baron Harkonnen, or even Leto II openly admitting that, like, in many ways he's possessed by his ancestor Agamemnon. Leto II had looked back to, like, the most primordial archetypical king to help guide his hand as he ruled his empire for 3,000 years, thereabouts. And that's only possible because of, like, the direct ancestry thing. Because the Reverend Mothers only normally just transfer their own personal memories and the other personal memories of Reverend Mothers they had that kind of mental contact with to each other, there is an internal discipline within that memory bubble. It's kind of like, it's like a holographic recreation in your mind of the person kind of a thing. I mean, like, certainly like borderline schizophrenic, psychotic kind of stuff, and yet like purposely indulged in the setting to create, human beings capable of doing stuff that, actual human beings shouldn't be capable of doing except under extreme circumstances. Part of, Leto's ability to, see into the future better than his father, Paul, is, predicated on the fact that, like, he has a much broader depth of historical perspective, and so he's got a much larger pool of data to pull from to be able to project all the various permutations of things. And Dune, the whole thing with prescience and seeing into the future, is much more a mathematical calculation than it is some sort of, like, a spiritual revelation. Albeit to the outsider or even to the inside observer, one could interpret it through that lens, obviously. And to, most people outside, they're going to more likely see it in a supernatural occurrence kind of framing. I still feel it's kind of weird that, like, it's how quietly it's kind of slipped by that, like, in Dune, there's like a lot of things that are very much, gender or sexual essentialism kind of built into it that you can't really get away from. If you could have a trans woman Bene Gesserit, then the idea that they've been needing to breed someone to be a Kwisatz Haderach, there is no need for that, if people with Y chromosomes are able to become Bene Gesserit anyway. So it's just weird how, like, overlooked that's been.
In the distant future of 1999, Amazon time barbarians fight to liberate the women of North America against vast armies of trolls and chads under the control of the Rogan Joe. This original tabletop role-playing game is thick with 2 C's. Available now on Amazon.com and DriveThru RPG.